You've been taught to recognize power when it looks like tanks, troops, and missiles. But the most effective form of power today doesn't fire a single shot. It turns off a switch. Right now, entire countries rise or fall, not because they lose wars, but because someone else controls their access to money, energy, and markets. Sovereignty no longer collapses with explosions. It collapses quietly through licenses, sanctions, and permissions you never see. This isn't chaos, it's design. A system where oil is no longer a resource, but a lever. Where finance is no longer neutral, but conditional. And where global order is enforced not by armies, but by control over who is allowed to function. If you think this has nothing to do with you, that's exactly how the system is supposed to feel. Stay with me, because once you see how this mechanism works, you'll never look at geopolitics the same way again. And to understand it, we have to start by defining the system itself. So let's be precise about what this system actually is. This isn't foreign policy driven by ideology. It isn't democracy promotion, and it certainly isn't humanitarian intervention. What we are watching is the construction of a resource governance model, where power is exercised by controlling access, not territory. Oil, finance, shipping routes, and legal permissions become the instruments that decide which governments survive and which slowly suffocate. In this model, tanks are inefficient, sanctions are scalable, military risk is replaced by economic certainty. Countries that depend on energy exports don't need to be invaded. They only need to be denied access to markets, to capital, to legitimacy. And once that access is conditional, sovereignty becomes theoretical. This is why enforcement matters more than declarations. And why a single seized oil shipment can reveal more about global power than 1,000 speeches. Because once the rules are enforced, the system no longer needs persuasion. To see how this works in practice, we have to look at the first real test of this doctrine. To understand why this system works, you have to understand where it comes from. For decades, power was measured by territory and troop movement. But repeated military interventions revealed a hard truth. Occupying land is expensive, unstable, and politically corrosive. Control gained through force rarely lasts. So the strategy evolved. Instead of changing regimes, the focus shifted to changing incentives. Instead of removing governments, the system began reshaping what those governments are allowed to do. And energy sits at the center of that shift. In resource-dependent states, oil revenue isn't just income. It's payroll, stability, and survival. Interrupt that flow, and pressure builds from the inside, quietly, relentlessly. This is why financial infrastructure matters more than firepower. Whoever controls access to markets controls time, and whoever controls time controls outcomes. The lesson learned from past failures was simple. You don't need to break the state. You just need to make its current behavior impossible to sustain. That logic sets the stage for the first real stress test of this doctrine, where theory turns into enforcement. The moment this doctrine stopped being theory was the moment enforcement became visible. 2 oil tankers were seized. One of them sailed under a Russian flag. For weeks, it had tried to disappear into legal ambiguity, changing identities, exploiting gray zones, assuming that nuclear status would guarantee immunity. It didn't. This wasn't a bureaucratic action. It was a line being drawn in real time, a declaration that the rules were no longer symbolic and that violating them would carry immediate consequences. What mattered wasn't the oil itself, it was the message. Enforcement had moved from paper to practice. And once that happened, every actor watching understood the shift. If a vessel linked to Russia could be taken without escalation, then protection was no longer guaranteed. Alliances became conditional, assumptions collapsed. This is how pressure works when it's systemic. You don't announce it loudly, you demonstrate it once and let the signal travel on its own. If you're finding this unsettling, that's because it's designed to be. And if this is where enforcement begins, the real question becomes, what is the mechanism underneath that makes this possible? That's what we need to uncover next. What makes this system powerful isn't the seizure itself. It's the mechanism that makes every seizure inevitable. At the center is something deceptively simple: permission. Modern energy doesn't move freely. It moves through banks, insurers, ports, legal clearances, and settlement systems. Each step requires approval. And when those approvals are centralized, control no longer needs visibility. This is what controlling the purse strings actually means: not holding cash, but deciding who is allowed to earn it. In this framework, oil production without access to markets is meaningless. Revenue without financial clearance is unusable. And a government without revenue doesn't collapse dramatically, it erodes. That erosion is the leverage. By turning access into a condition, power becomes automatic, compliance is rewarded with liquidity, defiance is met with delay, denial, and isolation, no invasion, no occupation, just narrowing options until behavior changes. This is why the system scales. It doesn't target ideology. It targets dependence. And once a state's survival is tied to approval from outside its borders, sovereignty becomes a managed variable. Now that the mechanism is clear, the next phase is predictable, because once a system proves it can enforce rules, it begins to expand them. That's where the second escalation begins. Once the system proved it could enforce rules, it did what all successful systems do. It scaled. Pressure no longer stopped at one country or one shipment. It began reshaping the entire environment around energy. The objective shifted from punishment to leverage, using supply itself to influence outcomes far beyond a single state. Venezuela's oil wasn't just about Venezuela anymore. It became a variable in global pricing. Increased supply and prices fall. Prices fall, and the revenue base of energy-dependent rivals weakens. What looks like market movement is, in reality, strategic compression. This is where the escalation becomes subtle and far more dangerous. Lower prices strain budgets. Strained budgets reduce military capacity. Reduced capacity limits geopolitical options, all without a single confrontation. And because this pressure is indirect, it's deniable. No one can point to a battlefield. No one can claim a clear act of war. The system simply adjusts, and consequences ripple outward. At this stage, enforcement no longer needs visibility. It becomes background gravity, felt everywhere, blamed nowhere. But systems don't operate in isolation. When pressure spreads, it always lands somewhere specific. And that brings us to the people who live inside these abstractions, where strategy turns into daily reality. And this is where the system stops being abstract. Because when access is restricted, it isn't governments that feel it first. It's you. When oil revenue tightens, public salaries freeze. Imports slow. Inflation creeps in quietly, then all at once. Daily life becomes a sequence of small calculations: what you can afford, what you postpone, what you give up. You're not told this is geopolitics. You're told it's scarcity. But scarcity isn't accidental here. It's pressure translated into lived experience. The system doesn't need to persuade you. It only needs to make the current path unsustainable until change feels inevitable. This is how leverage works at human scale, not through fear, but through exhaustion. And if you're listening to this thinking it only applies somewhere else, pause. Because systems built this way never stay local. They normalize control. They export precedent. If this perspective helps you see what's usually hidden, share it with someone who still thinks power only looks like war. Because once pressure reaches this level, it never stops with one country. Next, we need to look at how this logic reshapes the global balance itself. Once a system like this stabilizes, it stops being regional. What begins in one country quickly redraws the map for everyone else. Energy routes shift. Alliances thin. Neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Because when access to oil, finance, and markets is conditional, every state is forced to calculate risk in the same way. This is how pressure globalizes. Countries that once relied on discounted energy lose their buffers. Others are pushed to choose between compliance and exclusion. And when secondary sanctions enter the equation, even distance offers no protection. The system doesn't ask where you stand politically. It asks who you trade with. This is why enforcement matters more than rhetoric. Once the rules are proven real, behavior changes without orders being given. Governments adjust quietly. Contracts dissolve silently. Supply chains reroute overnight. What emerges isn't chaos, it's alignment. Not through consensus, but through constraint. And this is the point where the system reveals its real ambition. It isn't just about managing one crisis or one adversary. It's about shaping the future operating environment before competitors can. To see where this leads, we have to step forward in time. Because when a system reaches this scale, the only question left is how it evolves. From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. In the first scenario, the system stabilizes. Energy flows are gradually restored under strict conditions. Prices ease. Governments adapt. The pressure works not through collapse, but through compliance. Power becomes quieter, more normalized, almost invisible. In the second scenario, the system strains. Conditional access hardens positions. Some states resist. Workarounds multiply. Enforcement becomes heavier. Legitimacy thinner. Control still exists, but it requires constant intervention to hold. And in the third scenario, the system fractures. Too many actors push back at once. Alternative routes form. Parallel financial channels grow. The leverage that once felt absolute begins to dilute, not disappear, but weaken. What determines which path unfolds isn't ideology. It's dependency. Systems based on access only function as long as access cannot be replaced. That's the paradox. The more effective this model becomes, the more incentive others have to escape it. This is why the future isn't just about energy or sanctions. It's about whether control through infrastructure can outpace the creation of alternatives. And that leaves us with one final question, one that goes beyond policy, beyond geography. What kind of world are we building when power no longer needs to announce itself? That's where we end. What you've just seen isn't a conspiracy. It's a system revealing itself. Power today doesn't need to persuade you. It doesn't need to threaten you. It only needs to decide whether you are allowed to function. Access becomes obedience. Infrastructure becomes authority. And sovereignty becomes conditional, managed through energy, finance, and permission. This is why the most important battles of our time don't look like battles at all. They look like paperwork, they look like licenses, they look like delays that never make headlines. And once you recognize that, you start seeing the same pattern everywhere. Not just in one country, not just in one region, but in the architecture of the global order itself. The real question isn't whether this system works. It does. The question is what happens when everyone realizes how it works and starts building ways around it. If this analysis changed how you see power, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. These systems only stay invisible as long as people don't talk about them. And if you want to understand where this model is heading next, how it expands, and where it might finally break, then you'll want to watch what comes next. Because this story isn't ending here,